Under the porch shade at my 3-year-old grandson's birthday party, my son's hand tightened on my shoulder, gentle enough to look caring, but hard enough to hurt. He smiled and whispered, "Dad, you're tired. Go inside and rest. From now on, my wife and I will handle everything." Across the garden, my daughter-in-law watched me like an old asset about to change owners. I looked down at my glass. The bitter taste was still on my tongue. And in the middle of that lavish party, I understood they weren't waiting for me to rest. They were waiting for me to disappear. Before we begin, I am genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time here with me today. It means everything. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from your country? Your city, I would love to know. A small note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for reflection and storytelling purposes. Names and places are coincidental, but every lesson in it is worth carrying with you. The summer heat in the Hamptons that June afternoon pressed down like a warm, heavy hand on my shoulders. The kind of heat that makes old bones ache and old memories surface without warning. I stood at the edge of our backyard garden, a glass of lemonade sweating in my palm, watching the white linen tablecloths ripple in the breeze as caterers arranged bright balloons around a 3-tiered cake. Leo's 3rd birthday. My only grandchild. The one pure, untouched thing in my life that still made me smile without effort. "Dad, you're standing in the sun again." Thomas appeared at my elbow, clapping a hand on my back, with the practiced ease of a son who had learned to perform affection. He was dressed sharply, navy blazer, pressed slacks, and his smile reached his eyes just enough to look genuine to anyone who didn't know him the way I did. "I'm fine," I said. "I like the sun. You're 68, not 30. He steered me gently toward the shaded pergola. "Isabella said you've been skipping your checkups." "Isabella says a lot of things." Thomas's hand stiffened on my back for just a fraction of a second, almost imperceptible the way a guitar string tightens before it snaps. He recovered immediately and laughed. "She's just worried about you, Dad. We all are." I let him guide me under the pergola without another word, but my eyes drifted across the garden to where Isabella stood near the drink table. She wore cream-colored silk and a smile that belonged on the cover of a magazine, the kind of smile that was engineered, not felt. She was speaking to a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, square jaw, expensive watch. She laughed at something he said and touched his forearm lightly. "Who's the man with your wife?" I asked. Thomas followed my gaze and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Business associate. Something to do with the pharmaceutical division. You know how Isabella is always networking. On our grandson's birthday." "Dad, I'm not criticizing," I said evenly. "I'm observing." A shriek of pure joy cut through the garden. Leo came barreling across the grass in tiny sneakers that lit up with every step, arms thrown wide, heading straight for me with the kind of reckless abandon that only a 3-year-old could manage. Grandpa, look." He thrust a fistful of dandelions at me, his dark eyes enormous and bright. I picked flowers. My chest ached with something so tender, it almost hurt. I crouched down, ignoring the protest in my knees, and took the dandelions like they were orchids. "These are the most beautiful flowers I have ever seen," I told him seriously. Leo burst into the loudest, most genuine laughter I'd heard all year and threw his arms around my neck. My eyes burned, not from the sun, but from something I wasn't willing to name yet. I held him for a moment longer than necessary. When I straightened up, Isabella was watching us from across the garden. Her expression was not warm. It was the look of someone performing a calculation. "Arthur." She approached with her drink, her voice carrying the smooth, modulated tone of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. "You look tired. Thomas tells me you haven't been sleeping well." "Thomas worries too much. He loves you, She tilted her head, studying me with those sharp gray eyes. We both do. Actually, I've been meaning to speak with you about the Millbrook property. The market timing is sabalatunka. I said pleasantly, it's Leo's birthday. Her smile didn't waver. Of course, we can talk Monday? We'll see. She held my gaze for a beat too long, then turned away, touching Thomas's arm as she passed him a signal subtle as a chess move. Thomas cleared his throat and suddenly found his phone very interesting. I had built Miller Capital from a rented office and one client to a portfolio worth more than most people would ever see in their lifetimes. I had negotiated with men who smiled while they lied. I knew what it looked like. And standing in my own garden watching my daughter-in-law steer my son away from me with a touch. I felt the first cold thread of something I hadn't felt in years, not fear exactly, but the sharp animal instinct of a man who realizes he is being watched. Later, when the cake was cut and the candles were blown, and Leo had fallen asleep against my shoulder with frosting on his chin, I noticed Isabella slip away from the table. I watched her walk to the far end of the garden near the old stone wall. The man with the expensive watch was waiting for her. I couldn't hear them. But I watched Isabella pull a folded document from her clutch and hand it to him. He studied it, nodded once slowly. She said something that made him press his lips together and look toward the house toward me for just a moment. My arms tightened around Leo instinctively. The man pocketed the document, shook Isabella's hand, with two hands, the way people do when a deal is sealed, and walked toward the side gate without saying goodbye to anyone. Thomas appeared beside me with 2 glasses of wine. Here, he said. You look like you need this. I took the glass, but didn't drink. Thomas, I said quietly, who authorized the Millbrook property appraisal last week. He went very still. I saw the paperwork on my desk. I continued, my voice perfectly calm. The request came from your email, but I never asked for an appraisal. Thomas's grip on his wine glass tightened until his knuckles went white. It was just preliminary. Nothing formal. Isabella thought, I'll stop you there, I said softly. Because what I'm about to ask you is not a small question, Thomas. And I need you to think before you answer. He turned to look at me fully for the first time that afternoon. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not defiance, but something that looked almost like fear. What are you asking me, Dad? I looked down at Leo sleeping peacefully against my chest. His small hand curled around the lapel of my jacket, and I felt my heart crack open a little. Not from sadness, but from the quiet, determined resolve of a man who has just decided that enough is enough. I'm asking, I said, who you're really working for. Thomas never answered my question. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then, as if the universe itself had decided to interrupt the most important conversation of the year, Isabella called out from across the garden, her voice bright and artificial as a stage prop. Thomas, sweetheart, can you come help me with the dessert table? He looked at me with something raw and unfinished in his expression, the kind of look a man gives when he wants to say something, but has trained himself out of honesty. Then he turned and walked away, and I stood there holding my sleeping grandson, watching my son choose for what I suspected was not the first time the wrong direction. That night, after the caterers had gone and Leo had been carried off to bed by his nanny, I stayed behind on the back porch. The garden was quiet now, scattered with the debris of a happy afternoon, deflated balloons, cake plates, the crushed stems of dandelions on the patio table where I'd laid them. I turned my lemonade glass in my hand and thought about the man with the expensive watch, about the folded document, about the appraisal request I hadn't authorized. The thoughts moved slowly the way water finds the cracks in old stone, patient, inevitable. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning came hard and bright. I was on my second cup of coffee at the kitchen island when Isabella walked in, already dressed, briefcase in hand, moving with the brisk, purposeful energy of a woman who had already won the day in her own mind. "Arthur, good morning." She set her briefcase on the counter and reached past me for the water pitcher. "Sleep well?" "Well enough." Good." She poured herself a glass, turned to me with that polished smile. "About Millbrook, I know you said Monday, but I have a conference call at 9, and it would only take 5 minutes now if you—" "Isabella," I said, setting down my coffee, "who was the man you were speaking with at the party, the one by the stone wall?" Her hand moved just slightly, just barely, and the water pitcher tilted. A stream of ice-cold water poured directly off the counter and onto my lap. "Oh, Arthur, I'm so sorry." She grabbed a dish towel and thrust it at me, her voice exactly as alarmed as it needed to be, not a fraction more, not a fraction less. "I'm so clumsy. Are you all right?" I took the towel and blotted my trousers, watching her face very carefully. Her concern was flawless. Her eyes, however, flickered just for an instant to the briefcase on the counter before returning to me. "Fine," I said. "Who was he?" "A colleague." She straightened up, smoothing her blazer. "Marcus Hale, he runs a pharmaceutical development firm out of Midtown. Thomas has been exploring some investment opportunities." Thomas mentioned nothing to me. "It's early stages." She lifted her briefcase, checked her watch. "I really do have to take this call, Arthur. We'll talk properly, Monday, I promise." She was gone before I could respond, her heels clicking down the hallway with absolute confidence. I sat there with a wet dish towel in my hand and a feeling in my chest that was neither anger nor hurt. It was something colder, more focused. The feeling of a man who has just understood that he is not dealing with carelessness. That water had not been an accident. I knew because in 40 years of business, I had learned one thing about people who want to change the subject: they knock things over. I pulled out my phone and dialed. Helen. Dr. Helen Marsh had been my personal physician for 11 years, 60 years old, Johns Hopkins trained, and constitutionally incapable of softening bad news. When she answered, she sounded like she always did, already fully awake and mildly impatient with the world. "Arthur, it's 7:40 in the morning. I need you to come to the Hamptons' house today." A brief pause. "Your quarterly blood work isn't due until August." "I know. I want hair and nail samples taken. Full toxicology panel, the extended one." The pause this time was longer. When Helen spoke again, her voice had changed, quieter, more precise. "Arthur, why, I've been feeling off for about 6 months," I said. "Fatigue, occasional nausea, numbness in my hands sometimes." I told myself it was age. "You're 68, not 98. I heard her chair move. "I'll be there by noon. Don't eat anything unusual in the meantime. And Arthur, don't tell anyone I'm coming." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the island. Outside the window, the Hamptons' garden was still and golden in the morning sun, and somewhere upstairs I could hear Leo's small voice chattering to his nanny, a bright, unbothered sound that made my chest tighten with something fierce and protective. Helen arrived at 12:15 with a black medical bag and the no-nonsense expression of someone who had long ago made peace with delivering uncomfortable truths. She sat up at the kitchen table, took hair samples from the back of my head, where they wouldn't be visible, clipped 3 fingernail samples, and drew blood with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "So, talk to me," she said, labeling the vials without looking up. "What exactly have you been experiencing?" 6 months ago, maybe a little more, I started feeling exhausted in ways that didn't match my sleep. Then the nausea, mostly in the mornings. The hand numbness comes and goes. I thought it was stress. My portfolio had a rough quarter. Stress doesn't cause peripheral neuropathy in a man your age without some underlying cause." She sealed the last sample tube and finally looked up at me. The pattern you're describing, fatigue, nausea, numbness, it's consistent with chronic, low-level heavy metal exposure. My hand gripped the edge of the table. You mean poisoning? Helen didn't blink. I mean, I need the lab results before I say that word out loud. But Arthur, I want you to understand that if I'm right, this isn't a one-time event. Chronic exposure means this has been happening over a sustained period. Months, possibly longer. The kitchen felt suddenly very quiet. Upstairs, Leo laughed at something clear and bright as a bell, and that sound hit me somewhere underneath my ribs like a physical blow. How long would results take? I asked, and I was proud of how steady my voice came out. Choose rush order. I can have preliminary results in 48 hours. Full panel in 5 days. She closed her bag and held my gaze with the directness I had always valued in her. If what I suspect is confirmed, Arthur, this becomes a criminal matter, not a medical one. I know. Do you want to tell me who might have had consistent access to your food and drink over the past year? I thought about Silas Grant, quiet, efficient, always present, always in the background of every meal in this house, every morning, coffee, every evening, drink. I had hired him 3 years ago on Isabella's recommendation. He had come with impeccable references and a manner so unobtrusive, I had sometimes forgotten he was there. That was, I now realized, precisely the point. I have a name in mind, I said. But I want your results first. Helen nodded, once picked up her bag and headed for the door. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. Arthur, be careful what you eat and drink in this house until I call you. After she left, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The afternoon light stretched slowly across the floor, and I turned over every ordinary morning of the past year in my mind, every cup of coffee poured by steady, quiet hands, every glass set beside my plate without fanfare or suspicion. 48 hours. That was how long I had to wait for the truth, and something in my gut told me that when it arrived, nothing in this house would ever look ordinary again. The 48 hours Helen asked for felt like 48 years. I spent the first night lying awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slow and indifferent overhead, replaying every meal I'd eaten in this house over the past year. Every morning coffee, every evening scotch, every bowl of soup that Silas had set before me with those quiet, efficient hands and that expression of practiced loyalty that I had never once questioned. The nausea in my stomach wasn't from whatever had been accumulating in my bloodstream. It was from the realization of how completely I had trusted the wrong people. By the second morning, I stopped waiting and started moving. Silas Grant had been with our household for 3 years. 45 years old, impeccably professional, recommended by Isabella with a glowing 3-paragraph email that I had read once and filed without checking. He managed the Hamptons property, the kitchen, the household staff, the maintenance schedule, everything that kept the house running so smoothly I never had to think about it. That was, I now understood, a very deliberate arrangement. I found the first device on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after Leo's party. I had sent Silas to the village on a grocery run, a list long enough to keep him away for 90 minutes. Then I walked slowly through the ground floor of the house room by room with a frequency detector I had ordered online the previous evening and had delivered via same-day shipping. It was a small black device, no larger than a television remote, and it lit up red when it detected active wireless transmission signals within 20 feet. The kitchen, nothing. The dining room, nothing. The living room, a single red pulse near the antique grandfather clock in the corner. My pulse spiked. I crossed the room, moved the clock forward an inch from the wall, and found it a wireless listening device no larger than a shirt button affixed to the back panel with a small adhesive strip. Professional grade. Not something you picked up at an electronics store. My hands were steady, my chest was not. I left it exactly where it was. The study showed 2 more. One behind the frame of Eleanor's portrait above the fireplace, my late wife's face watching over a room that had just become a surveillance zone, and one underneath the lip of my desk where I took every important phone call. I sat down in my desk chair very slowly, like a man who needed to be careful about how much weight he placed on things. My throat felt tight. I thought about Eleanor, about the portrait, about whoever had stood in this room and pressed a listening device against the wall beneath her face, and I felt a fury so clean and so cold, it almost felt like clarity. I pulled out my phone and called Thomas. He answered on the second ring, his voice carefully casual. "Dad, everything okay?" "Come to the study," I said. "Now. Don't tell Isabella you're coming." 3 minutes later, Thomas appeared in the doorway, in a t-shirt and running shorts, hair still damp from a shower. He looked younger when he wasn't dressed for performance, younger and right now visibly nervous. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping inside. "Close the door." He did. I pointed to the chair across from my desk without speaking. Then I picked up a notepad and wrote in large, clear letters, "This room is bugged. Don't react. Speak normally." I watched Thomas read those 4 words. I watched the color drain from his face like water from a tub, slow and complete, until he looked like a man who had just been told something he already knew, but had hoped desperately never to have to confront. "So," I said aloud conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather, "I was thinking we'd take Leo out on the boat this weekend. What do you think?" Thomas's voice cracked slightly when he answered. Yeah, that sounds great, Dad." Under that cover, I wrote on the notepad, "Do you know about these devices?" He stared at the question for a long moment. His jaw worked. His hands gripped his knees until the knuckles whitened. Then he shook his head, one short, sharp movement, and something in his eyes looked so genuinely wrecked that for one moment I almost believed him. "Who has access to this room?" I wrote. He reached for the pen. His hand trembled as he wrote 2 words. "Silas. Isabella." I took the notepad back, underlined both names. Then I wrote the last thing, the question I needed him to answer more than any other: "Did you authorize this?" Thomas looked at that question for what felt like a very long time. His eyes went glassy at the edges, not quite tears, but close enough that the sight of it twisted something in my chest. That specific father pain of watching your child standing at the edge of something they cannot come back from. He picked up the pen. His writing was unsteady. "No, I swear to God, Dad. No." I looked at him carefully. In 40 years of reading people across boardroom tables, I had developed a reliable instinct for the texture of a lie. What I saw in Thomas's face right now was not the smooth surface of practiced deception. It was the jagged, desperate look of a man who was in over his head and had been for a long time. I wasn't ready to forgive him for the things I suspected he'd allowed, but I noted with the precision of a man building a case that he was not the architect. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and said aloud, pleasantly, "Good. I'll ask Silas to pack the cooler." Then I picked up my phone and typed one message to a number I hadn't used in 8 months. "Ray, I need a meeting, not on the phone. Tomorrow. Bring your badge." I hit send and set the phone face down on the desk, exactly as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. The drive from the Hamptons to Manhattan the next morning took just under 3 hours, and I spent every mile of it thinking about Silas Grant. I thought about the way he moved through the house, precise, soundless, always at the right distance to be helpful without being intrusive. I thought about the morning coffee he prepared every day without being asked, setting it on my desk, with the particular brand of instant familiarity that I had read as devotion and now reread as access. I thought about Isabella's glowing recommendation email, 3 paragraphs of praise for a man she claimed to have known through professional circles, and I wondered what exactly those circles looked like, and what they had discussed in the center of them. By the time my driver pulled up outside the restaurant in Midtown, a quiet Italian place on 52nd Street, where the booths were deep and the music covered conversation, I had built a preliminary timeline in my mind that made my blood run cold. Ray Colton was already there when I arrived. Let me tell you about Ray. He is 52 years old, my late wife's cousin's son, which makes him family by a route that involves enough twists that most people stop trying to map it. He has worked with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for 19 years, long enough to have watched 2 recessions, 3 major fraud trials, and 1 very public Ponzi scheme collapse with the particular brand of weary, gimlet-eyed patience that comes from spending 2 decades watching rich people do terrible things to each other over money. He was a lean man with close-cropped salt and pepper hair, a permanently creased forehead, and the kind of still watchful energy that made people at dinner parties instinctively lower their voices. He stood up when I walked in, shook my hand with both of his firm brief, and studied my face the way a doctor reads an X-ray. "You look like hell, Arthur," he said. "Thank you, Ray. You look exactly the same. I'm serious." He sat back down as I slid into the booth across from him. "How long have you actually been sick? And Helen called you?" "She called me this morning, off the record." He folded his hands on the table. "Preliminary results came back. You want to hear them here, or?" "Here is fine." He pulled a folded printout from the inside pocket of his jacket and smoothed it on the table between us, angling it toward me. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the numbers. The arsenic levels in my hair samples were 3 times the normal threshold. The timeline embedded in the readings because arsenic deposits in hair in measurable increments, as the hair grows, functioning almost like a biological ledger, indicated chronic low-level exposure beginning approximately 14 months ago. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. 14 months, I said. That's what the preliminary shows. Full panel will be more precise. Ray's voice was even professional, the voice of a man who had learned to deliver bad news without flinching. "Arthur, this is not accidental. This is a deliberate, sustained campaign." I set my cup down carefully. My hand was completely steady, and I was bizarrely proud of that. "I need you to understand something before we go further," Ray said, leaning forward slightly. "If I open a case on this, it becomes federal. The moment federal law enforcement is involved, you lose control of the timeline. Things move at the Bureau's pace, not yours. Are you prepared for that?" "Not yet," I said. "I need more evidence before we formalize anything." Ray studied me for a moment. "What do you have?" I told him about the listening devices, about the frequency detector, the grandfather clock, Eleanor's portrait, the desk. I told him about the Millbrook property appraisal I hadn't authorized, about the man Isabella had met at Leo's party, the folded document, the handshake, the name, Marcus Hale. Ray's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened instantly. "Marcus Hale, as in Hale Pharmaceuticals." Then Isabella said Thomas was exploring investment opportunities with him. Investment opportunities. Ray repeated the phrase slowly, the way you repeat something that means something different from what it appears to mean. He pulled out his phone and typed a note. "Arthur Hale Pharmaceuticals has been under informal scrutiny for approximately 8 months over a patent acquisition that the FDA flagged as irregularly expedited. If Isabella is brokering a deal between Hale and Miller Capital without your knowledge or authorization, then she's using my company's assets and reputation as leverage in a deal I never agreed to," I finished. "Not which, depending on the structure of the deal, could constitute securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially wire fraud if any of the communications crossed state lines." He set his phone down. "Which, given that Hale is based in New Jersey, and this conversation presumably happened in New York, they almost certainly did." I took a long, slow breath. The air in the restaurant smelled of garlic and bread, warm and ordinary, completely indifferent to the fact that I was sitting in a booth, mapping out the dimensions of my own family's betrayal. "There's something else," I said. "I want you to explain Section 81 to me. Simply. Like I'm not a lawyer." Ray nodded, unsurprised by the request. New York Mental Hygiene Law Article 81 allows a court to appoint a guardian to manage the personal and financial affairs of someone deemed incapacitated, meaning they can no longer make sound decisions for themselves. To trigger the process, someone petitions the court. A judge then appoints an evaluator to assess the person. If the evaluation supports incapacity, the judge can remove that person's control over their own assets and place it in a guardian's hands. And the guardian could be a family member. Yes, a spouse, an adult child, or their legal representative. He held my gaze steadily. It's designed to protect vulnerable people, but it's also in the wrong hands, a mechanism for financial control. All it takes is a cooperative medical evaluator and a compelling narrative about a wealthy, elderly man who is showing signs of decline. The words landed like stones in still water. "How long would it take?" I asked. "From petition to guardianship." In New York, the process typically takes 60 to 90 days from filing to court hearing. But the filing itself can include a request for emergency temporary guardianship, which a judge can grant in as little as 72 hours if the evidence of incapacity appears urgent. 72 hours. I turned that number over in my mind. "They'd need a doctor's testimony," I said. "Yes, a licensed evaluator." Ray paused. "Arthur, do you have reason to believe someone is attempting to build that case against you?" I thought about Isabella's smooth mention of my missed checkups. I thought about Thomas telling her I hadn't been sleeping. I thought about 14 months of arsenic accumulating quietly in my body, while Silas Grant set my morning coffee on the desk with those steady, devoted hands. "I think someone has been building it for over a year," I said. Ray sat back in his chair and pressed his lips together in a thin, grim line. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked genuinely shaken, not panicked, but the kind of shaken that comes from a man who has seen enough to know exactly how serious a thing is. "Okay," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. You don't confront anyone. You don't change your routine. You let them believe everything is proceeding on their schedule." He leaned forward again. "And you let me make some calls quietly, carefully, nothing that opens a file yet. Just background, and the listening devices, so you leave them exactly where they are." A thin, deliberate smile crossed his face for the first time. "Because if they're listening to you, Arthur, we can make sure they hear exactly what we want them to hear." I picked up my coffee cup again, and this time my hand was steady as bedrock. "Now you're speaking my language," I said. But even as I said it, something in the back of my mind kept circling back to the DNA results. Helen had mentioned the secondary test she'd run without elaborating on the one she'd said she needed to verify before discussing. Whatever that verification was, I had a feeling it was going to change the shape of everything I thought I understood about my family. Helen called at 8:30 in the morning, 2 days after our meeting in Midtown, while I was sitting on the back porch of the Hamptons house, watching the ocean turn gold in the early light. I picked up on the first ring. "Arthur." Her voice carried that particular brand of clinical gravity that told me before she said another word that the news was not good. The full panel came back. "The arsenic levels are confirmed chronic exposure, 14 months minimum, consistent with deliberate low-level dosing." Helen paused. "But that's not why I'm calling." My grip on the phone tightened. "Tell me, the secondary sample, the hair I took from Leo's brush when I used the guest bathroom at the party, Another pause, shorter this time, the kind a doctor takes before she says the thing that changes everything. Arthur Leo is not Thomas's biological son. The ocean kept moving. A pelican skimmed low over the water. The world went perfectly, absurdly normal, while something inside my chest cracked open like old timber. "You're certain," I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "I ran it twice. The paternal markers don't match Thomas, but they do match the secondary male profile I pulled from the sample on your desk chair, the one I took, without telling you, from the fiber I found on the armrest. I believe that sample belongs to whoever sits in that chair regularly when you're not home. Silas." The name dropped through me like a stone through deep water. "Helen," I said carefully, "this information stays between you and me. And Ray. Understood?" "Arthur, are you all right?" "No," I said honestly. "But I will be." I ended the call and sat very still for a moment. The phone warm in my palm, the morning light falling across my hands. Thomas had no idea. I was almost certain of that. Thomas had raised Leo as his son from birth, and until that moment he had no reason to question it. He loved Leo. I had watched him with that little boy, watched the way his whole face softened when Leo reached up for him, the way he swung him onto his shoulders without being asked. Whatever else Thomas had done or allowed or looked away from, he did not know that the child he was raising was not his. And Isabella knew exactly whose it was. That knowledge settled in me like something heavy and permanent. Then I stood up, squared my shoulders, and went inside to play my role. That evening, Isabella hosted a dinner for the four of us herself, Thomas, myself, and Claire Thomas's sister-in-law, who had been staying in the East Wing for the past week. Let me be clear about Claire. She was 36 years old, pleasant-faced, with the kind of careful social grace that people develop when they've spent years managing other people's moods. She was Thomas's younger brother, Daniel's widow. Daniel had passed 3 years ago, and she had remained close to the family, particularly to Isabella, in ways I had never fully examined until now. Claire had been staying in the East Wing since Daniel's death, close enough to the family that no one questioned her presence anymore. Silas served the meal. I watched his hands as he poured the wine, those same steady, practiced hands, and I felt something so acidic in my throat that I had to take a slow breath through my nose to keep my expression neutral. "Arthur, you're barely touching your food," Isabella said from the head of the table, her voice warm with precisely calibrated concern. "Appetite's been off," I said pleasantly. "You know how it is at my age. That's exactly what worries me." She set down her fork and folded her hands, and I recognized the posture immediately. It was her courtroom posture, the one she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while advancing a position she'd already decided on. "Thomas and I have been talking. We think it might be time for a full neurological evaluation." Thomas's fork scraped against his plate. He didn't look up. "A neurological evaluation," I repeated. "So just as a precaution. You've been forgetting things, appointments, documents. And Dr. Reeves at Columbia Presbyterian is extraordinary. We'd just feel better knowing Isabella." I smiled at her across the candlelight, warm and unhurried. "I appreciate your concern, but I had a full physical just last month. Everything checked out beautifully." Her smile held, but her eyes recalculated behind it. "Of course. I just want to be sure you're being taken care of." "I am being extremely well taken care of," I said, and I let my gaze move just briefly, just long enough to Silas, who was refilling Thomas's water glass at the sideboard. Something flickered across Silas's face. Just for a fraction of a second, not guilt exactly, but the particular micro-expression of a man who has just realized he may have been seen. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual mask of professional serenity. Claire cleared her throat softly. The salmon is wonderful, Silas. Thank you, Miss Claire, he said, smooth as glass. I picked up my fork and ate a small, deliberate bite and kept my face pleasant and tired and old the way they needed me to look. Under the table, my free hand curled into a fist against my thigh, not from fear, but from the effort of containing something that wanted very badly to come out. After dinner, as Silas cleared the plates, Thomas followed me into the hallway. He touched my arm, and when I turned, his face was tight with something he was clearly fighting to keep from spilling over. "Dad," he said in a low voice barely above a breath, "be careful what you eat here." My heart hammered once hard against my ribs. "Thomas, I can't say more right now." His eyes cut toward the dining room, then back to me, and what I saw in them was not the face of a conspirator. It was the face of a man who was frightened. "Just please, be careful." He turned and walked back toward the dining room before I could respond, and I stood alone in the hallway with my heart pounding and the terrible clarifying realization that my son was not entirely lost. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because my mind wouldn't stop turning over what Thomas had said in the hallway. Those 6 words that had cracked open a gap in everything I'd assumed about him. Be careful what you eat here. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to be frightened. Enough to warn me in a whisper while his wife was 20 feet away. I lay in the dark and turned that warning over and over like a stone with something written on the underside, trying to read it clearly. By 5 in the morning, I gave up on sleep, dressed quietly, and called Helen. She answered in 2 rings. "I was expecting you to call earlier, honestly. I needed to think first." I kept my voice low, the bedroom door locked. "Helen, I want to start the chelation protocol. Today, if possible." Helen started a medically supervised chelation protocol and monitored my kidney function weekly, while the toxicology team documented the arsenic exposure. The medication works by binding to arsenic molecules in the bloodstream and carrying them out of the body through the kidneys. It's not glamorous. It involves daily oral doses, strict monitoring of kidney function, and enough fatigue to make a man already running on disrupted sleep feel considerably worse before he feels better. But it was the only medically sound way to begin reversing 14 months of damage. "I've already prepared the prescription," Helen said briskly. "I'll have it couriered to the Midtown address you trust, not the Hamptons house. And Arthur, I need you on weekly blood work. I have to monitor your kidney function carefully while you're on DMSA." "Understood." "There's something else." I heard papers shuffling on her end. "I've been reviewing the accumulation pattern in your hair samples more carefully. The dosing isn't random. It's precise, low enough to avoid acute symptoms that would send you to an emergency room, high enough to produce the chronic fatigue, the cognitive fog, the neuropathy. Whoever is administering this knows what they're doing. This isn't someone who read about arsenic poisoning online. This is someone with access to the right compounds and the knowledge to dose them correctly." My throat tightened. "Medical background or pharmaceutical. The compound signature I'm seeing is inorganic arsenic, not the naturally occurring organic form you'd find in trace amounts in food. This is synthesized, which means it came from somewhere very specific. Marcus Hale. Hale Pharmaceuticals." The name Ray had said with that quiet, sharpened tone. "Helen, I need you to document everything. Every sample, every result, every date. If this ever goes to court." "It's already documented," she said firmly. "I've been treating you for 11 years, Arthur. I know how to protect my patients and my practice. Every result is time-stamped, sealed, and a copy has gone to a secure off-site server that is not on any network connected to you, me, or anyone in your family." I exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just take the medication and don't die." A pause, then more quietly. "I mean that sincerely. I almost smiled despite everything. I know you do. I drove into the city that afternoon, under the pretense of a lunch meeting, which was true, just not the lunch I'd mentioned to Isabella. I met Ray at a different location this time, a nondescript office in a building on Lexington Avenue that housed, among other things, a private legal firm and 2 floors of what looked from the lobby like generic corporate consulting space. Ray was waiting in a conference room on the 4th floor with 2 other people I hadn't expected. The first was James Whitfield, my attorney of 22 years. James was 64, silver-haired, meticulous, in the way that only truly good lawyers could sustain over decades. The kind of man who read contracts the way musicians read scores, hearing things between the lines that ordinary eyes missed. He rose when I walked in and shook my hand with a grip that communicated wordlessly that he already knew most of it and was already angry on my behalf. "Arthur," he said simply. "James." The second person was a woman I didn't know, early 40s, dark suit, a tablet in front of her, and a yellow legal pad beside it filled with notations. Ray introduced her. "This is Dr. Patricia Alden. She's a forensic toxicologist I've used on 3 federal cases. I've already briefed her on Helen's preliminary findings, completely off the record at this stage." Dr. Anand extended her hand and shook mine with brisk professionalism. "Mr. Miller, I want to be up front with you. What I've reviewed in Dr. Marsh's preliminary data is some of the most methodically executed long-term poisoning I've seen outside of a case study. Whoever did this was patient and careful. That actually works in your favor legally because it demonstrates intent far more convincingly than a single acute event would." "How so?" I asked, settling into my chair. Acute poisoning can be argued as accidental contaminated food source environmental exposure. 14 months of precisely calibrated dosing cannot. The pattern itself is evidence of premeditation. She tapped her tablet. Combined with the compound signature Dr. Marsh identified, inorganic arsenic synthetic origin, we can trace the supply chain. That chain, if it leads where I think it does, gives you a direct evidentiary link between the person administering the poison and the person supplying it. Ray leaned forward. "I made some quiet inquiries about Hale Pharmaceuticals last night. Marcus Hale's company holds 3 patents on arsenic-based oncology compounds, experimental cancer treatments. They're not commercially available. They're locked behind clinical trial protocols. But the raw compounds exist in his facilities." James set down his pen. "So the theory is that Isabella brokered access to a controlled pharmaceutical compound through Hale and used Silas Grant as the delivery mechanism." "That's the theory," Ray said. "We need evidence before it becomes anything more than that." "The listening devices in the house," I said. "If Silas or Isabella discuss the sourcing on a recorded line, we need those recordings to be legally obtained." James cut in. "New York is a one-party consent state, but hidden recordings of conversations you are not part of can create legal problems. Anything we use must come from conversations you personally participate in or from lawfully obtained evidence." Then I need to be home more," I said. "Yes." James folded his hands on the table. "And Arthur, we need to begin reviewing your estate documents. All of them. Trust structures the willpower of attorney designations. If an Article 81 petition is coming, I want to have already built a wall they cannot climb over." The room was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet of people who have just finished laying the first stones of something that would take months to build. "One more thing," I said, and I looked at Ray directly. "Thomas warned me last night. Told me to be careful what I eat in the house. He was scared, Ray. Not performing, actually scared." Ray and James exchanged a look, so that changes his position considerably. James said slowly. "It means he might be coerced rather than complicit. Ray added. Which means he might be reachable. I nodded. But I need to know how deep he's in before I reach for him. Because if I reach and he pulls Isabella instead of me, then everything we've built collapses, James finished. Exactly. Outside the window, Manhattan moved at its relentless pace, indifferent and enormous, all glass and steel and the steady noise of 10 million lives happening at once. And somewhere inside all of that, in a courthouse or a firm or a pharmaceutical facility in New Jersey, people were already moving pieces on a board they thought I couldn't see. They were about to find out how well I could see. But before any of that could happen, I needed to find out what Thomas was truly afraid of, and whether that fear could be turned into something useful. Something like courage. Thomas liked to run in the mornings, always had, ever since he was 17. And trying to outpace the anxiety that came with being the son of a man who expected great things. He still ran the same 3-mile loop around the property when we stayed at the Hamptons, out through the East Gate along the beach road, back through the orchard. I had watched him do it every morning for 20 years. So on the first Thursday of July, I was sitting on the low stone wall at the orchard gate at 6:45 in the morning waiting for him. He nearly ran into me. He pulled up short, breathing hard, earbuds dangling, sweat darkening his shirt at the collar, and his face moved through surprise and then something else, something complicated, that settled after a moment into a kind of exhausted relief. Dad. He bent forward with his hands on his knees, catching his breath. You scared the hell out of me. Sit down, Thomas. He looked at the wall, then at me, then back at the empty orchard behind us, as if calculating the geometry of exits. Then he sat. We're outside, I said quietly. No devices, no one can hear us. I paused. I need you to tell me about the DP7 patent. Whatever color the morning run had brought to his face drained out of it. His jaw tightened so hard, I could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. Where did you hear that? He asked, his voice rough. Does it matter? Adidum. Thomas. I kept my voice low and steady the way I used to when he was a boy, and I needed him to understand that what I was saying was not a suggestion. I am not asking as your father right now. I am asking as the man whose name is on every document, every filing, every fund that Isabella has been using. So I need you to look at me and tell me exactly what you know. He stared at the ground between his feet for a moment, his hands gripping his knees, knuckles white. Then he let out a breath that sounded like it had been compressed inside him for months. She brought me the proposal 14 months ago, he said. His voice was rough, like something being dragged over gravel. Marcus Hale approached her through the patent bar they'd worked together on a pharma licensing case years back. Hale had this compound DP7, an arsenic derivative oncology treatment. The FDA had flagged the expedited application because Hale's clinical trial data was thin. He needed a co-sponsor with credibility, a name that would lend weight to the submission. My name, I said. Thomas flinched. Miller Capital. Isabella said it was a passive endorsement, that we wouldn't even need to file anything directly. She'd structure it through a subsidiary so there'd be insulation. Thomas. My voice came out harder than I intended, and he flinched again. I made myself soften it. Did you sign anything? She said she'd handle the paperwork, that I'd review it before anything was finalized. He rubbed his face with both hands, pressing hard, like he was trying to physically rearrange his thoughts. And then 6 months went by and I kept asking, and she kept saying it wasn't time, yet it was still in preliminary stages, and then one day I found a filing in her home office that had my signature on a document I had never seen before. The morning air felt very still. A bird called somewhere in the orchard, high and indifferent. Your forged signature, I said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something broken at the hinge between the two. I confronted her. She said it was a clerical error, that she'd correct it. And then she looked at me with those eyes, Dad, and she said, he stopped. His throat worked. What did she say? And she said that if I made this difficult, she would tell you that I had been the one who initiated the deal. That I had been embezzling funds from the Miller Capital discretionary account for 2 years to cover personal debts. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. And she has documentation. I don't know if it's real or manufactured, but she has something that looks real enough to destroy me. My chest ached. Not with anger, I'd moved past anger somewhere around the 3rd sentence. This was something deeper, older, the particular heartbreak of watching your child standing at the bottom of a hole they partly dug themselves and partly fell into, and knowing that the only way to get them out is to make them face how deep it goes. Thomas, I said carefully, are you in debt? He nodded, jaw tight. About 400,000. Bad investments 2 years ago. I was going to tell you, but then Isabella said she could manage it, and I let her. Like an idiot, I let her. You're not an idiot, I said. You're a man who trusted someone who specialized in making herself trustworthy. That's different. He looked up at me then, and his eyes were red at the rims, wet in a way he was trying furiously to hold back. And he looked for a moment so much like the 17-year-old boy who used to run these same paths to escape his own anxiety that my chest hurt with the specific pain of time passing and things going wrong that you couldn't have stopped even if you'd tried. Is there a way out of this? He asked. His voice cracked on the last word. Yes, I said, but you have to trust me completely, and you have to do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. He held my gaze for a long beat, searching, assessing the way people look at a rope when they're not sure it'll hold their weight. Then he nodded, slow but real. Okay, Dad, he said. Okay. I drove back to the city that same afternoon, the windows down the July air warm and smelling of cut grass and highway tar, Thomas's broken voice still sitting somewhere in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. He had agreed to cooperate. He had also agreed to say nothing to Isabella, to carry on as normally as he could, to give her no signal that anything had shifted between them. That was asking a great deal of a man who was already barely holding together. But he had nodded again when I asked, and I had to trust that the same stubbornness that had let him stay in a bad situation this long would now work in my favor. Ray and James were waiting for me at the Lexington Avenue office by 4 o'clock. The moment I walked through the door, I could tell from the way Ray was standing, weight forward, hands flat on the conference table, the posture of a man who has just received information he cannot quite contain that something significant had broken open. Sit down, Arthur, he said. You're going to want to be sitting for this. I'll stand, huh? I said. Tell me. Ray glanced at James, who gave a slight nod, then pulled up a document on the screen mounted on the conference room wall. Over the past week, I've had 2 colleagues at the Bureau running background checks on Marcus Hale's recent financial activity. Nothing formal, just pattern analysis from publicly available filings and a few conversations with contacts in the FDA Oversight Office. Ray tapped the screen. DP7, the compound you mentioned, Hale filed a co-sponsorship application with the FDA 8 months ago. The co-sponsor listed on the application is a subsidiary called Miller Biomedical Ventures, LLC. My vision sharpened. That entity doesn't exist. It didn't exist until 14 months ago. James said, his voice professionally flat, in the way that meant he was furious. It was registered in Delaware under a shell structure. The registered agent is a law firm in Newark. But the beneficial owner of record, he let the pause sit for one deliberate second. Is Isabella Miller. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. She created a fake subsidiary in my family's name, I said. using the Miller name and reputation to give Hale's FDA application the institutional credibility it needed, Ray confirmed. The filing lists Miller Biomedical Ventures as providing both financial backing and proprietary research data to support the DP7 clinical trial. Research data, Arthur, that appears to have been derived from Miller Capital's internal pharmaceutical investment analyses, reports your own analysts prepared, as part of normal due diligence, repurposed and submitted to the FDA without your knowledge or authorization. James stepped in. In legal terms, this constitutes fraud on a federal regulatory body, securities fraud, given the investment implications, and wire fraud, because every communication in furtherance of the scheme crossed state lines. For Isabella personally, as a licensed attorney, it also constitutes a breach of professional ethics, severe enough to warrant disbarment proceedings. I pulled out a chair and sat down. After all, the arsenic in the DP7 compound, I said slowly, thinking out loud. Hale's facility is the source. That's what Dr. Annan's compound signature analysis suggests, Ray said. We're not there yet. Evidentially, we need a direct chain of custody. But the circumstantial architecture is strong. Hale supplies the compound, Silas administers it. Isabella orchestrates, Thomas is silenced through manufactured debt documentation. He paused. It's clean, it's coordinated, and it's been running for over a year. And the motive for poisoning me specifically? I asked, though I already knew the answer in my bones. Section 81, James said. If you present as cognitively declining confusion, memory gaps, fatigue, personality changes, Isabella files the Article 81 petition. The arsenic symptoms mimic early-stage dementia convincingly enough to satisfy a court-appointed evaluator who isn't looking too carefully. Once the guardianship is granted, she controls Miller Capital. She controls the Millbrook property. She controls everything. I thought about Silas setting my morning coffee down, about the slight tremor in my hands I'd dismissed as age, about the fog I'd sometimes felt at 3 in the afternoon that I'd blamed on too many early mornings. How long before I can get the collation results to show meaningful improvement? I asked. Helen says 6 to 8 weeks of consistent treatment, Ray said. Enough to demonstrate you are cognitively sharp and medically stable, the opposite of the picture they've been building. Good. I turned to James. I want every Miller Capital document reviewed. Every filing, every authorization, every signature that touches anything connected to Hale or DP7. I want to know exactly what exists and what has been fabricated. Already started, James said. I've brought in 2 forensic accountants. They began this morning. There's one more thing, Ray said, and something in his tone shifted, quieter, more careful, the way he sounded when he was about to hand me something heavy. The DNA results. What about them? I ran a separate quiet check on Silas Grant's background. The reference he provided Isabella when she recommended him for the household position, it traces back to a man who doesn't exist. Clean background, excellent references, but the employment history is fabricated. What I did find, however, he pulled up another document on the screen. Silas Grant's real name is Curtis Aldrin Grant. He has a prior conviction in Pennsylvania fraud, 2014. 2 years served, released 2016. He moved to New York in 2017 and remade himself. The name landed in the room like a stone. Isabella knew, I said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly, James said. Which means his presence in your household was never incidental. He was placed there, deliberately, with full knowledge of his background and his willingness to do what needed to be done. I sat with that for a moment, the image of Silas moving through my house for 3 years, quiet and precise and utterly known to Isabella in ways I had never imagined. I thought about Leo, about a 3-year-old boy who shared DNA with a man named Curtis Aldrin Grant, and had no idea, would never have any idea what the adults around him had built and broken in the years before he was old enough to understand any of it. "Leo," I said quietly. "Yes," Ray said, and for the first time since I'd started working with him on this, he sounded genuinely pained. "The child is entirely innocent in all of this." I know." My voice came out rougher than I intended. I pressed my lips together and steadied it. "Which is why what we're building has to be airtight. Not just for me, for him." Ray studied my face for a moment. "There's something you're planning that you haven't told us yet." "Not yet," I said, "but soon." I picked up my briefcase and stood, and as I did, my mind was already moving ahead to the will James had mentioned, to the trust documents, to the particular satisfaction of watching something you have built with your own hands become finally bulletproof. But before that, before any of the legal architecture could be completed, I needed to understand one more piece of the puzzle. I needed to know what Isabella and Silas had said to each other in my house, while they believed no one was listening. Because the old grandfather clock in the corner of my living room had been listening for 3 weeks, and it was almost time to hear what it had recorded. Before I tell you what Arthur discovered on those recordings, something so shocking it changed everything he thought he knew about his own home, drop a 9 in the comments right now. Just so I know you are still here with me. A gentle reminder, this story contains some fictional elements shaped for reflection and storytelling. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, you are free to step away at any time. But if you are staying, you will want to hear what comes next. Ray sent the audio files at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into July, with a single text message that read, "Pulled and cleaned the recordings. Sit down before you listen. All 3 devices. 41 hours total." I've time-stamped the sections you need to hear first. I was at the Midtown apartment, the one Isabella didn't know. I kept a modest 2-bedroom on the 31st floor that I'd maintained under a separate holding entity for exactly the kind of occasions when I needed to think without being watched. I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, and pressed play on the first file. The first 20 minutes were ordinary. Staff conversation, kitchen sounds, the mundane machinery of a household running. Then, at the 23-minute mark, I heard Isabella's voice and my hand tightened around my coffee cup so hard, the ceramic creaked. "Is he taking the supplements?" she said. Silas's voice answered smooth and unhurried. "Every morning. He hasn't questioned anything." "Good. The fatigue should be more pronounced by August." "Helen Marsh is the variable I'm most concerned about. If Arthur asks her for a second opinion, I can manage that," Silas said. "I have the name of a certified evaluator who does private consults. Dr. Fenwick at Riverside. He's done 3 Section 81 evaluations in the past year." "When I know Fenwick," Isabella said, and there was something in her voice, a particular warmth, the warmth of someone discussing a business arrangement they find satisfying. "He's thorough when he needs to be and flexible when that's more useful. I'll reach out to him directly." I stopped the recording. My hands were perfectly steady. My chest was not. I pressed play again. The next flagged section was 40 minutes later. Different room, the acoustics shifted, the background hum of the house changing in the way it does when you move from the kitchen to the study. I heard Claire's voice lower and quicker than usual, like someone talking fast to stay ahead of their own nerves. "Silas, you promised me this would be over by September." "It will be." Silas's voice was entirely different when he spoke to Claire, softer, more careful, the way you speak to something you're not sure you can hold. "Once the guardianship is through, we get paid and we leave. It's that simple." "Nothing about this is simple." Claire's voice cracked at the edges. Leo is right upstairs. He's 3 years old, Silas. Every time I look at him, don't. Silas's voice sharpened. Don't do that to yourself right now. He's your son, Claire said, and her voice broke fully on the last word, splintering in a way that cut through the recording and landed in my chest like something sharp. He's your son, and you're in this house poisoning his grandfather, and you want me to just… Claire. His voice went hard and flat. Enough. A long, unsteady breath from Claire. Then footsteps. Then the sound of a door closing. I paused the recording and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through my nose for several slow seconds. The Manhattan skyline sat outside the window, indifferent and glass and steel going about its infinite business, while I sat in a kitchen chair and absorbed the weight of what I'd just heard. Claire knew. She had known for some time. She was not the architect. The terror in her voice was real, but she was not innocent either. And the fact that she was in that house near Leo, knowing what Silas was doing and staying anyway, made something surge in me that I had to actively press down before it became something I couldn't control. I called Ray. He answered immediately. You listened. Claire is involved, I said. Not as a planner, she's terrified. But she knew about the arsenic. Yes. Ray's voice was measured. Which complicates things. And Fenwick, Dr. Fenwick at Riverside. Do you know the name? I do now, Ray said. He appeared in 2 of my colleagues' case files, both times as a court-appointed evaluator in Article 81 proceedings that were later flagged for irregularities. He's never been formally sanctioned, but he's on a watch list. Can we get to him before Isabella does? I've already made a call, Ray said. I have a contact at the State Medical Board. Fenwick will receive a very quiet, very persuasive reminder about the consequences of submitting fraudulent evaluations in federal nexus cases. That should slow Isabella's timeline considerably. I exhaled. There's something else on the recording. Silas promised Isabella he'd have the compound sourced for the next 3 months. He mentioned a delivery schedule, a storage location. Where? The garage at the Hamptons property, the locked cabinet in the northeast corner behind the landscaping equipment. Ray went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was very careful. Arthur, don't touch that cabinet. Don't go near it. If what's in there is what we think it is, it becomes physical evidence. The moment you touch it, chain of custody is compromised. I know, I said. I won't touch it. I'm going to make a call to the Suffolk County DA's office. Off-the-record exploratory, just to understand what a warrant application would look like if we needed to move quickly. A pause. Arthur. There's one more flagged section on the recording. Timestamp 2 hours, 14 minutes, second device. I want you to listen to it before we speak again. It concerns something I wasn't expecting. What is it? Just listen, he said, and then call me back. I ended the call, found the timestamp, and pressed play. What I heard in the next 4 minutes made my blood run so cold that I had to set the laptop down on the table and stand up and walk to the window and stand there with my forehead pressed against the cool glass, staring down at the city 31 floors below, breathing through the kind of shock that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply settles into your bones and changes everything permanently. The recording told me that Silas Grant didn't just plan to walk away with $800,000. He planned to make sure there was no one left to come looking for it. I didn't call Ray back that night. I needed 12 hours with what I'd heard before I could talk about it without my voice giving something away. So I sat in the Midtown apartment, ordered food I barely touched, and spent the night going over the recording at timestamp 2 hours and 14 minutes until I could hold it in my mind without my hands shaking. What Silas had said to someone on a phone call, a call I now knew from the audio quality and the single-sided nature of the conversation had been made from my study while I was at dinner, was this: the old man's not going to be a problem past October. Once the evaluation goes through and the transfer is done, we clean the slate. The wife too, if it comes to that. I've done cleaner jobs than this. Clean the slate. He had said it the way a man says, take out the trash, casual, functional, entirely without feeling. And in those 6 words was the thing that changed the shape of everything I'd been building. This was no longer about money. This was no longer about guardianship or patents or forged signatures. This was about whether my wife and I would be alive to see the new year. I called Ray at 6 in the morning. I heard it. I said the moment he picked up, I know. His voice was already wide awake and very grim. Arthur, we are past the exploratory phase. This is a credible threat against your life. Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 1117 covers conspiracy to commit murder. The moment Silas said those words on a recording in your home, he crossed a line that we cannot step back from. I know what I want to do, I said. Tell me. I want to confront him. Today. Before he has any reason to think anything has changed. A brief pause. Arthur. Not impulsively, I said firmly. Strategically. With everything in hand. I want to give him the choice between federal prosecution and cooperation. If he flips on Isabella, we get everything: the poisoning, the patent fraud, the Section 81 scheme. Everything. Another pause, longer this time. Then, if you do this, I want Thomas in the house as a witness, and I want a recording device running. Both already planned, I said. I drove back to the Hamptons that morning. The July heat was dense and white, the kind that turns the highway into a long silver mirage. And I drove through it thinking about Silas, about 3 years of him moving through my house, about coffee cups and dinner plates, and the small accumulated trust of 1,000 ordinary mornings, and I let myself feel the full measure of that betrayal for exactly the length of the drive. Then I parked, got out, and put it away. Thomas was waiting on the porch, as I'd asked him to be. He looked like he hadn't slept. His face was drawn tight, and there were shadows under his eyes the color of old bruises, and when he saw my expression, he straightened up immediately. You found something, he said. I found everything, I said quietly. Stay in the sitting room. Keep the door open. Don't come in unless I call you. He grabbed my arm before I could move past him. His grip was tight and urgent, and his eyes were bright with something between fear and desperation. Dad, what are you going to do? Have a conversation, I said. Go inside, Thomas. I found Silas in the kitchen, as I'd known I would. He was at the counter, methodical and unhurried, pressing coffee grounds into a filter with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this ritual so many times it had become muscle memory. He heard my footsteps and looked up, and his face arranged itself into its customary expression of attentive, pleasant professionalism. Mr. Miller, good morning. Coffee will be ready in... Sit down, Silas. Something shifted behind his eyes, fast, barely perceptible, the flicker of a man recalculating. But he sat. And I placed my phone on the counter between us, a screen down, and I sat across from him, and I looked at him the way I had looked at men across boardroom tables for 40 years, when I wanted them to understand that I already knew what they'd done, and the only remaining question was what they planned to do about it. Curtis, I said. The color left his face so fast it was like watching a light switch off. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, pressed flat against the surface, an involuntary brace, the body's reaction to impact. I don't know what you... Chuck-tucks. Curtis Aldrin Grant, I said calmly. Pennsylvania 2014. Fraud conviction, 2 years served, released 2016. You arrived in New York in 2017. New name, new references, all of them fabricated. Isabella knew every detail of your background when she recommended you to me. I paused. And you've been dosing my morning coffee with inorganic arsenic sourced from Marcus Hale's pharmaceutical facility for the past 14 months. Silas's breathing changed. His chest rose and fell faster, and the professional mask cracked along every line at once, like a windshield struck from the center, holding its shape, but shattered entirely. "That's a serious accusation," he said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. It came out thin and slightly high, the voice of a man who is frightened, but has not yet decided whether to run. "It's not an accusation," I said. "It's a documented fact. Hair samples, compound analysis, a toxicologist who testified in 3 federal cases, and—" I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a printed transcript on the table, a partial transcription of the recording Ray had prepared. "Your own words. From my study. 3 weeks ago." Silas stared at the transcript. His eyes moved across the lines, and I watched the fight go out of him, not all at once, but steadily, like air from a slow leak, until he was sitting across from me, looking like a man who had just understood that every door he thought was open was in fact locked. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice came out hoarse and small. "Chakichaim." "I want you to understand your position," I said. "Federal charges conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud administration of a controlled substance without consent, and because of what you said in that phone call, Curtis conspiracy to commit murder. You are looking at 25 to life. You know what happens to men with your prior record when they walk into a federal courtroom." His throat moved. His hands were trembling now, a fine, visible tremor that he couldn't control. But I continued, my voice remaining entirely even. "There is another option. You cooperate fully, every detail of what Isabella asked you to do, what she paid you to do, what she promised you. Every communication, every instruction, every delivery schedule. You give that to the federal investigators, you testify under oath, and in exchange your cooperation is documented and presented to the prosecutor." Silas pressed his trembling hands flat on the table, trying to stop the shaking. His eyes were wet at the corners, and he blinked hard several times, fast, the look of a man fighting to hold himself together because falling apart in front of me was the last remaining thing he had. "She'll destroy me," he said, "if I talk." "She's going to prison," I said. "The only question is whether you go with her." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the July garden sat in full green, entirely peaceful, and somewhere upstairs I could hear Leo's little feet crossing the floor above us, that small, bright, innocent sound, and I saw Silas hear it too, and I watched something move across his face that wasn't calculation or fear, but something rawer than either of those things. He closed his eyes. His shoulders dropped. And when he opened them again, the man who looked back at me across the kitchen table was not the composed, invisible professional who had served my household for 3 years. He was just Curtis Grant, frightened, cornered, and out of road. "Okay," he said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "Okay. I'll talk." Thomas was still on the porch when I came out of the kitchen. He had heard every word I'd made, sure the sitting room door stayed open just as I'd told him. He was standing with his back against the railing, arms crossed tight over his chest, and when I appeared in the doorway, he looked at me with an expression that I could only describe as a man seeing something he'd been afraid to look at directly for a very long time. "He agreed," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "He agreed," I confirmed. Thomas pressed his lips together hard. His jaw worked. Then he turned away from me and gripped the porch railing with both hands and stared out at the garden, and I could see in the set of his shoulders the particular weight of a man absorbing the full dimensions of how badly things had gone wrong in his own house. Dad. His voice came out rough, scraping the edges of something he was fighting to hold back. I let this happen. I know that. I let her in, and I looked away, and I killed Thomas. I walked out to stand beside him. We're not doing that right now. Right now, we move. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were red and glassy, not quite crying, but the kind of raw that comes just before. He nodded once, twice, swallowing hard. What do you need from me? He asked. Keep acting normal, I said. Isabella cannot know anything has shifted. Not yet. Can you do that? He let out a breath that shook slightly on the way out. I've been acting normal for 14 months, Dad. I think I can manage a few more weeks. The bitterness in those words landed like a stone in still water. I put my hand on his shoulder, brief, firm, and he pressed his lips together again and straightened up, pulling himself back together with the visible effort of a man rebuilding a wall with his bare hands. Ray arrived at the Hamptons' house that afternoon with James Whitfield and a woman I hadn't met before a court reporter, compact and precise, who set up a recording system at the dining room table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this in considerably more chaotic circumstances. Ray introduced her only as Carol, which I understood to mean her full name was not relevant to what we were doing. Silas came downstairs when I called him, dressed in his usual staff clothes, his face composed in a way that looked almost like the old professional mask, but not quite. The edges were wrong. His hands, when he sat down across from Carol and her equipment, trembled faintly, and he pressed them under the table when he noticed me notice. Before we begin, Ray said, placing a document in front of Silas, I want to explain what this is. This is a proffer agreement. It means that what you tell us today cannot be used directly against you in prosecution, provided that what you say is truthful and complete. If you lie or omit material facts, the agreement is void. Do you understand? Silas looked at the document. His throat moved as he swallowed. Yes. Do you want an attorney present? A beat. Then, no. Let's get through it. What followed was 3 hours of the most exhausting and necessary listening I had ever done. Silas talked. He talked about Isabella approaching him 6 months before he was officially hired a lunch in Midtown, a very clear articulation of what she needed and what she was willing to pay. He talked about the arrangement with Marcus Hale, the compound deliveries, the precise instructions for dosing 2 milligrams per morning dissolved in the coffee undetectable at that concentration in a standard blood panel. He talked about Dr. Fenwick, the agreed-upon evaluation timeline, the language Isabella had scripted for the Article 81 petition. And then, unprompted, his voice dropping to something barely audible, he said, the phone call, the one where I said what I said about cleaning the slate. He stopped. His shoulders curved inward. I want you to know that I said it. I know I said it. But I don't think I could have actually. Curtis, Ray said very carefully, what you said on that call constitutes a criminal threat regardless of intent. But your cooperation here matters. Tell me about the person you were speaking to. Silas closed his eyes briefly, opened them. A man named Derek Webb. He ran. I don't know, a crew out of South Jersey. Isabella introduced us. I think she wanted insurance. Someone further downstream who could be directed if things needed to move faster. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Ray and James exchanged a look that contained entire paragraphs of professional communication. Is Webb still in contact with Isabella? Ray asked. As of 2 weeks ago, yes, Silas said. Ray sat back in his chair and said nothing. For a moment, his eyes focused on the middle distance in the way they did when he was rapidly reorganizing everything he'd assumed about a case. Then he looked at me. Arthur, he said quietly, This just became significantly more serious than a financial crime case. I know, I said. I need to make a formal notification to the Bureau, today. Do it, I said, as Carol packed up her equipment and Ray stepped outside to make his calls. James leaned across the table toward me, his voice very low. The threat element changes our timeline. We can't wait for September. The dinner confrontation, the public reveal, we need to move it up. How soon? I asked. 3 weeks, James said. Maybe less, depending on how fast Ray's notification moves up the chain. I glanced at Silas, who was sitting very still at the other end of the table, staring at his own hands, with the hollow expression of a man who had just handed over the last thing he owned. He looked up and met my eyes, and for one unguarded second, there was something in his face that was almost impossible to read. Not remorse exactly, not relief exactly, but something that lived in the narrow space between the two, thin and fragile as new ice. There's one more thing, he said quietly. Claire doesn't know I've done this. When she finds out, that, I said, is something you're going to have to manage yourself. Ray's formal notification moved faster than any of us expected. Within 48 hours of Silas's proffer session, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had opened a preliminary investigation file, not yet a full case, but enough to trigger legal holds on Isabella's communications through Hale Pharmaceuticals' registered networks. Ray called it quietly catastrophic for Isabella's side, because she wouldn't know the hold existed until she tried to move something and found it frozen. That moment of discovery, Ray said, was when people made mistakes. We didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the proffer session, Isabella called me. Her voice was warm and completely composed, which told me immediately that she didn't know about Silas. Arthur, I've arranged for Dr. Fenwick to stop by on Friday for an informal health consultation. Just a wellness check, nothing formal. Thomas mentioned you'd been having some memory issues recently. My jaw tightened. Thomas had mentioned no such thing, which meant Isabella had scripted that detail and expected me to accept it without question. That sounds very thoughtful, I said. Friday works perfectly. I ended the call and immediately texted Ray Fenwick is coming Friday. We're ready. His response came in under a minute good. I'll have 2 agents positioned. Johns Hopkins' team is on standby. Let him run his evaluation. Don't perform, just be tired and slightly confused. Not dramatic, subtle. The instructions were precise, because the trap had to be precise. Here is what we needed Dr. Fenwick to do: conduct an evaluation that he believed was legitimate produce, a written assessment supporting cognitive decline, and submit that assessment as part of the groundwork for Isabella's Article 81 petition. The moment he submitted a fraudulent medical evaluation to a New York court, he committed a crime, and every communication surrounding that submission would become evidence. What he did not know was that Dr. Helen Marsh would be reviewing every word of his assessment, and that a forensic psychiatry team from Johns Hopkins' 3 board-certified specialists, with combined experience that dwarfed Fenwick's entire career, would be providing a counter-evaluation based on the exact same observations. If Fenwick's assessment diverged materially from what 3 independent specialists observed, his credibility and his medical license would be finished. Dr. Fenwick arrived at the Hamptons' house on Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of polished, reassuring bedside manner that came from years of practice, the sort of doctor who made you feel examined and cared for simultaneously. He shook my hand with a warm, 2-handed grip and introduced himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any room he entered. Mr. Miller, thank you for seeing me. Isabella speaks very highly of you. She's very kind, I said. I had dressed carefully for this. Not the sharp suit of a man in control, but slightly rumpled trousers, a shirt that was 1 button off, the reading glasses I didn't strictly need, sitting crooked on my face. Small details. the kind of details that a careful observer would note, and a less careful one would absorb subconsciously. Fenwick settled into the armchair across from me in the study, the same study where my desk still had a listening device under its lip, and opened his leather portfolio with the manner of a man beginning something routine. "I'm just going to ask you a few questions and we'll have a conversation," he said. "Nothing to be nervous about." "I'm not nervous at all," I said, and let my gaze drift to the window for just a moment too long in the way a man does when his attention slips. Fenwick noted it. I watched his pen move. For 40 minutes, I gave him exactly what he needed. Slight hesitations before certain words. A repeated question about whether we'd already covered a particular topic. A moment of apparent confusion about the date I said August when it was the first week of August, then corrected myself with a small, embarrassed laugh. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just the quiet, granular picture of a man whose edges were softening in ways that were concerning to people who loved him. Fenwick was good at what he did. I'll grant him that. His questions were carefully structured, his manner never slipped into anything resembling agenda, and he was skilled at the kind of conversational indirection that teases out responses without appearing to push. Under other circumstances, I might have respected him professionally, but 3 times during the session, he asked questions that had no clinical basis. Questions about my relationship with Thomas, about whether I felt supported in my financial decisions, about whether I sometimes felt overwhelmed by the complexity of managing Miller Capital. Those questions were not diagnostic. They were narrative building. They were the questions of a man constructing a story, not examining a patient. When he left at 3:30 portfolio under his arm, he shook my hand again with that same warm, two-handed grip and told me he'd have some notes for Isabella within the week. "Take good care of yourself, Mr. Miller," he said. "I always do," I said pleasantly. The moment his car pulled out of the drive, I pulled out my phone and called Helen. How was it?" she asked immediately. "Such a textbook," I said. He built exactly the narrative we expected. 3 questions that were pure framing, not clinical assessment. His pen moved every time I let my attention drift. The Johns Hopkins team reviewed the session in real time through the camera feed, Helen said. Dr. Caldwell's preliminary note is already written. His conclusion, no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. In fact, his note specifically states that the subject demonstrated, and I'm quoting, unusually high executive function and strategic coherence for any age cohort. I laughed a real one, brief and sharp, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. Make sure that quote makes it into the final report. Already flagged, Helen said. Arthur, when Fenwick submits his assessment, and it goes into the Article 81 filing, we have him. The moment that document is filed with the court, it's fraud. And every email, every phone call, every communication between him and Isabella building toward that filing becomes part of the evidentiary record. How long before she files, I asked. If she's moving on the schedule Silas described, she'll file within 2 weeks of receiving Fenwick's assessment. Which means we have 3 weeks at most, I said. Possibly less. Arthur. Helen's voice shifted lower, more personal, the voice she used when she was speaking to me as a friend rather than a physician. How are you holding up genuinely? I sat for a moment in the quiet study, the late afternoon light falling golden across Eleanor's portrait above the fireplace. My late wife's painted face looking out at me with that particular expression the artist had captured, steady, warm, knowing, the exact expression she had worn in life when she understood something I hadn't yet caught up to. I'm tired, I said honestly, but I'm not done. Good, Helen said. Because James called me an hour ago. He's finalized the new will and the charitable trust documents. Everything is in place. My heart rate shifted, not with anxiety, but with the particular deep-seated steadiness of a man who has spent weeks building something and can now see the outline of what it will become. "Then we're ready," I said. "Almost," Helen said. "There's one piece James said you'd want to handle personally before the dinner. Something about a letter. He said you'd know what he meant." I looked at Eleanor's portrait for a long moment. Her steady painted eyes, the knowing expression. "Yes," I said softly. "I know exactly what he means." And for the first time in months, I felt something shift in my chest. Not the crack of heartbreak or the cold weight of anger, but something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of a man who has finally stopped running from what is coming and started walking directly toward it. 3 weeks, maybe less. It was time to set the table. James came to the Midtown apartment on a Thursday morning in the middle of August, carrying a leather briefcase that I knew from 22 years of working with him contained something significant. He set it on the kitchen table, accepted the coffee I offered without comment, and sat down with the particular posture of a man who has prepared very carefully for a conversation he knows will not be easy. "Before we go through the documents," he said, "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." Are you certain?" He held my gaze without blinking. "Once this trust is executed and the will is filed, there is no reversing the charitable transfer. The assets move to the foundation permanently. Miller Capital, the Hamptons property, the Midtown holdings, all of it restructured, all of it outside the reach of any Article 81 petition, any guardianship filing, any claim Isabella or anyone else might make." He paused. "You've spent 40 years building this. I need to know you're certain." I looked at him for a moment. Through the window behind him, Manhattan moved in its relentless way, traffic glass, the distant sound of sirens going somewhere urgent. "James," I said, "the only thing I've spent 40 years building that actually matters is sitting in a nursery in the Hamptons taking a nap right now. Everything else is numbers." James held my gaze for one more beat. Then he opened the briefcase. For the next 90 minutes, he walked me through every document. The Irrevocable Charitable Trust, formerly named the Eleanor Miller Children's Heart Foundation, in honor of my late wife, who had volunteered at a pediatric cardiac unit for 11 years before her illness took that from her. The new will restructured entirely, leaving the majority of Miller Capital's assets to the foundation and a contingent bequest to Thomas, an amount sufficient to clear his $400,000 debt and establish a modest but comfortable life, contingent on his cooperation with federal investigators and his completion of financial counseling. And a separate education trust for Leo, ring-fenced and protected, accessible only for his educational needs until age 25. The Article 81 petition becomes essentially meaningless the moment this trust is executed, James said, tapping the relevant document. An appointed guardian can manage a person's remaining personal assets, but they cannot reach into an irrevocable trust. The foundation assets are gone from Arthur Miller's personal estate the moment we file. Isabella's entire strategy collapses. "When can we execute?" I asked. "This afternoon, if you're ready. I've arranged for a notary and 2 independent witnesses. Everything is prepared." "Then let's do it this afternoon." James gathered the documents back into the briefcase with deliberate, careful movements. Then he reached into the side pocket and placed a plain white envelope on the table between us. "This came with the files I pulled from Eleanor's personal documents when we restructured the estate last year," he said. "I've been holding it because I wasn't sure when or whether to give it to you." A pause. Her handwriting, dated 4 months before she passed. My hand moved toward the envelope before I'd consciously decided to reach for it. The paper was smooth and slightly cold. Eleanor's handwriting on the front, just my name, Arthur, in her particular looping script, that I would know anywhere in any context until the day I died. "I'll give you some privacy," James said, and stood and took his coffee to the window without being asked. I opened the envelope. Her letter was 3 pages, handwritten. The script slightly unsteady in places. She had been very ill by then, and her hands had not always cooperated, but entirely characteristically Eleanor. She wrote the way she had spoken, directly, warmly, with a dry precision that could crack you open before you saw it coming. She wrote about Leo first, about how much she loved watching Thomas with him, and how she hoped Arthur would be there for that boy in ways that mattered, not just in ways that were financially comfortable. She wrote about the Hamptons' house and the garden and the dandelions she had always refused to pull because she said a weed is just a flower that nobody important decided to value. And then in the second page, she wrote about Isabella. "I've never said this to you because I didn't want to be the kind of woman who poisons a marriage with her own intuitions. But since I won't be there to say it later, Isabella is afraid of you, Arthur. Not of your anger or your power, but of the specific thing that frightens people who are always calculating. She's afraid of someone she can't calculate. Watch her closely. She smiles when she should frown, and frowns when she thinks no one is looking. I don't know what she wants, but I know that whatever it isn't Thomas's happiness or yours." My eyes burned. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose hard, and my breath came out unsteady, and for the first time in months, for the first time since Leo's birthday party, when I'd held those dandelions and felt the world begin to tilt, I let myself feel the full, devastating weight of missing her. I cried. Not quietly, not with dignity. I sat in my kitchen in a 31st floor apartment in Manhattan and cried the way a man does when he has been holding something enormous for a very long time, and the structure finally gives. James kept his back to me at the window. When I was done, I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in my inside jacket pocket against my chest. "On James," I said. My voice was rough but steady. He turned around. His eyes were slightly bright, which he dealt with by straightening his tie unnecessarily. "Let's execute the trust," I said, "and then I have a dinner party to plan." The charitable trust was executed at 4:17 that same Thursday afternoon. James filed the documents with the New York Surrogates Court the following morning. A routine filing, nothing flagged, nothing unusual on its face. To anyone examining the public record, it looked like an elderly man updating his estate plan, the kind of thing that happened 1,000 times a week in Manhattan. What it actually was, as James had explained it to me with the quiet satisfaction of a man who loves good architecture, was a wall 20 feet thick and completely invisible until you walked directly into it. I gave myself exactly 1 day to feel the full weight of what I had done. Then I called Ray. "The trust is filed," I told him. "Good." His voice carried that focused, forward-leaning energy of a man nearing the end of a long operation. "The FBI's hold on Isabella's Hale Pharmaceuticals communications has turned up 3 additional emails. She and Marcus Hale discussed the compound sourcing directly, not through intermediaries. Those emails, combined with Silas's proffer testimony, give us a direct evidentiary chain from Hale's facility to your bloodstream." My stomach turned, but I kept my voice even. "What's the timeline on charges?" "The prosecutor I've been working with wants the confrontation dinner to happen first. He wants to see how Isabella responds when cornered, whether she tries to destroy evidence, whether she contacts Hale or Webb. Her behavior in the 48 hours after the dinner will inform how he structures the charges." Ray paused. "Arthur, we need to set a date." "Saturday, September 6th, I said. "The Hamptons' house. I'll invite them as a family dinner. Thomas's involvement, the estate restructuring, I'll frame it as an important family discussion. Something they won't want to miss. And Marcus Hale, I had thought about this carefully. Separate invitation, I'll tell him I want to discuss a potential investment partnership. He'll come. A brief silence. Then Ray made a sound that might have been the closest thing to a laugh he permitted himself during an active investigation. You're inviting the man who supplied the poison to the dinner where you exposed the poisoning. I find that symmetry satisfying, I said. So do I, Ray admitted. I'll coordinate with the prosecutor's office. We'll have agents positioned outside, not visible but close. Recording equipment will be in place through the existing devices in the study and the dining room. And Arthur, his voice dropped slightly. Derek Webb has been located. He's under surveillance as of yesterday. He won't be a factor on the night. The relief that moved through me at those words was so complete it left me briefly lightheaded. Thank you, Ray. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when it's over. I wrote the invitations by hand. There was something deliberate about that choice. Isabella was a woman who understood power as a language, and the language of a handwritten invitation from Arthur Miller was unmistakably the language of a man who expected to be taken seriously. I used the heavy cream stationery from the desk in my study, wrote each card with the pen Eleanor had given me on our 30th anniversary, and I chose my words with the precision of someone laying out the last hand in a game that had been running for 14 months. To Thomas and Isabella, I wrote a family dinner. September 6th, 7 o'clock. There are matters of importance regarding the Miller estate that require your presence. I look forward to seeing you both. To Marcus Hale, I wrote, I have been reviewing a potential investment opportunity in the pharmaceutical development space and believe a conversation between us is overdue. Join me for dinner, September 6th, 7 o'clock, Hamptons. I sealed both envelopes and set them on the entry table. Thomas found them there that evening. He had come by the apartment on the pretext of checking on me, which we had agreed was a reasonable cover for our regular contact. He picked up the envelope with his and Isabella's names on it, felt the weight of it, and looked at me with a question in his face that he was afraid to ask out loud. It's time, I said simply. Thomas set the envelope down carefully. His hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that he tried to control by pressing his fingers flat against the table. His face was doing the complicated thing it did when he was fighting multiple emotions at once. I could see the fear. Yes, but underneath it, something else. Something that had been building since that morning in the orchard, when he'd told me about the forged signature and the manufactured debt and the long exhausted surrender of a man who had stopped fighting because he'd forgotten what he was fighting for. Dad, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. What if she figures it out before the 6th? What if she runs? She won't run, I said. Isabella is not a woman who runs from confrontation. She's a woman who controls it. She'll come to that dinner because she believes she is still controlling this. She'll come because she thinks I'm declining, because Fenwick's assessment is sitting in her email, because the trust filing looks routine, and she has no reason yet to think otherwise. Thomas swallowed hard. And when she walks in and realizes none of that is true, then she'll discover, I said, that the man she's been underestimating for 14 months has been one step ahead of her for every single one of them. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, something moving through his face that I hadn't seen in years, something that looked like the sun I remembered before everything went complicated and expensive and wrong. His eyes went very bright, and he pressed his lips together hard. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. His voice was rough, barely holding together. I'm so sorry I didn't come to you sooner. I'm sorry I let it go this far. I'm sorry Hey. I stepped toward him and put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I had when he was young and overwhelmed. We're going to fix it. That's what matters. He pressed his forehead briefly down chin to chest, a gesture of exhaustion and something close to relief. And I felt his shoulders shudder once under my hand before he pulled himself upright again. "Okay," he said, rougher but steadier. "Okay." I handed him the envelope. "Take this home. Give it to Isabella tonight. Watch her face when she reads it." He took it. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. "What will her face do?" "Nothing she'll want it to," I said. "That's how you'll know she's worried." After Thomas left, I stood in the quiet apartment and thought about September 6th, about the table being laid, the chairs arranged, the evidence assembled, every piece exactly where it needed to be. The Eleanor Miller Children's Heart Foundation was alive in the public record. The wall was built. The trap was set. And somewhere in a house by the water, a woman who had spent 14 months managing my decline was about to read a handwritten card and feel for the very first time the particular chill of a plan running away from her. I hoped the penmanship gave her pause. I hoped more than that the date did. September 6th was Eleanor's birthday. September 6th arrived the way Eleanor's birthdays always had, quietly, with a kind of golden afternoon light that turned everything it touched into something worth looking at twice. I stood at the window of the Hamptons' dining room at 6:15 that evening, watching the sun flatten against the water, and I pressed my hand against the letter in my inside jacket pocket, still there, still warm, and I said very quietly, to no one in particular, "I kept my promise, Eleanor, every last piece of it." By 6:45, the table was set. James arrived first, dressed impeccably, and took his seat at the far end of the table with the composed stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to anchor one. He gave me a single nod when I met his eyes across the room. Everything was in place. Marcus Hale arrived at 6:55. He walked in, looking exactly as he had at Leo's birthday party, square-jawed, confident, the expensive watch catching the chandelier light, and he shook my hand with the smooth assurance of a man who believed this was a business dinner. "Arthur, good to finally meet properly," he said. "Isabella speaks very highly of your instincts. She's always been generous," I said pleasantly. "Please sit down." Isabella and Thomas arrived at 7 on the dot. Isabella walked in wearing deep burgundy silk and that magazine cover smile, and she swept the room with those sharp gray eyes in the single second it took her to cross the threshold, cataloging, assessing, noting James at the far end, noting Marcus already seated, recalibrating at a speed that would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. But I was watching for it. Her eyes found mine and the smile held perfectly. "Arthur, the house looks beautiful." "Thank you," I said. "You look well, Isabella." Thomas was a half-step behind her. He looked like a man walking into something he had agreed to, and was now in the physical reality of it finding considerably harder than the agreement had felt in the abstract. His face was pale and set his jaw tight, his eyes cutting briefly to mine with a question in them that I answered with the smallest movement of my head. Hold. Claire had come as well. She had been staying in the East Wing, and I had included her in the invitation deliberately. She took her seat without speaking to anyone, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has been dreading a specific moment for a long time and can now feel it arriving. We ate the first course. Conversation moved the way it does when everyone at a table knows something is wrong and has agreed by unspoken consensus to pretend otherwise surface topics, careful phrasing the elaborate performance of a normal evening. Isabella talked about a case she was wrapping up. Marcus asked about the Millbrook property. James responded to every direct question with perfectly calibrated pleasantry and volunteered nothing. I watched Isabella watch James. I watched her recalibrate again, something shifting behind her eyes, a slight tightening at the corners. She was starting to feel the shape of the room. Between the first and second course, I stood up. "Before we continue," I said, "there's something I'd like to share with everyone. The room went very still. Isabella's hand tightened around the stem of her wineglass. Marcus glanced between her and me with the sudden alertness of a man who has just realized the nature of the meeting has changed. "I've had an interesting few months," I said conversationally. "Some health challenges, some financial reviews, some discoveries." I picked up the remote control from beside my plate, small, black, unremarkable, and pointed it at the wall behind me. The 4K screen mounted above the sideboard came to life. The first image was a document, the Miller Biomedical Ventures LLC filing Delaware registration, Isabella Miller, listed as beneficial owner. Clean, clear, irrefutable. "That's my family's name on a shell company I never authorized," I said. Isabella's face did not collapse. She was too skilled for that. But something behind it shifted, like watching the structure of a building take its first hit still standing. But you could see in the geometry that the standing wouldn't last. "Arthur, I can explain," she started. "I know you can," I said. "You're an exceptional explainer. Please hold that thought." The screen changed. Emails, the direct correspondence between Isabella and Marcus Hale, time-stamped discussing the DP7 compound, sourcing the clinical trial co-sponsorship, the routing of Miller Capital's research data through the shell company. Marcus Hale pushed back from the table with the abruptness of a man whose body reacted before his mind caught up. "What the hell is... Mr. Marcus?" James said, his voice dropping into its courtroom register, quiet and absolute. "I would strongly advise you to remain seated." The screen changed again. Dr. Fenwick's evaluation, and beside it, side by side, the Johns Hopkins counter-evaluation, the one that described Arthur Miller as demonstrating unusually high executive function and strategic coherence for any age cohort. Isabella's wineglass trembled in her hand. She set it down hard. "And this," I said, "is perhaps the most important one." The screen showed 2 DNA reports, side by side. The first, Thomas Miller paternal DNA profile. The second, Leo's profile. And the column that showed paternal match, highlighted in red, pointing not to Thomas, but to a third profile labeled C.A. Grant. The sound Thomas made was unlike anything I had ever heard from my son. It came from somewhere below language, below composure, below the 41 years of learned self-control, a single, raw, broken sound, like something structural giving way. He pressed both hands flat on the table and his whole body shook with it. And the look on his face was the look of a man whose entire world had just been handed back to him in pieces. "She's not..." He couldn't finish the sentence. His voice was gone. "Thomas." Isabella reached for his arm. He yanked it away from her so hard his chair scraped. "Don't." His voice came back low and shaking and barely controlled. "Don't you dare touch me right now." The dining room held its breath. Isabella stood at her end of the table with both hands pressed flat on the white linen, her knuckles drained to white her chest, rising and falling with the visible effort of a woman who was still, even now, even here, trying to find the angle. Her eyes moved fast to me, to James, to the screen, to the door, calculating, always calculating, even as everything she had built for 14 months dissolved under the chandelier light. Thomas had pushed his chair back and was sitting with his elbows on his knees, head down, hands laced behind his neck, breathing in the deliberate, effortful way of a man trying to keep himself from coming completely apart in public. His shoulders shook once, twice, a fine tremor he couldn't stop, and the sight of it made my chest ache with the specific, helpless pain of a father who can see his child suffering and knows that the only mercy available is to let the truth finish what it started. Marcus Hale had both palms on the table and was looking at the emails on the screen with the expression of a man watching a car accident he was in. Claire was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, tears tracking down her face with the quiet inevitability of someone who had known this moment was coming and had spent months dreading it, and was now in a terrible way almost relieved that the waiting was over. I looked at each of them. Then I walked to the hallway door and opened it. Silas walked in. Isabella's head snapped up. The color that had drained from her face came back in a rush. Not warmth, but something hotter and harder than that. You. Her voice came out low and raw, stripped of every professional layer. You absolute Isabella. James's voice cut through the room like a clean blade. I'd encourage you to think very carefully before you say anything else. Silas stood inside the doorway, not moving forward, his hands at his sides, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is holding that decision in place through sheer force of will. He looked worse than he had in the kitchen 2 months ago. Thinner, hollower, the eyes of someone who had been living inside a decision he couldn't take back. I want to say something, Silas said. His voice was rough but steady. To Thomas. Directly. Thomas lifted his head from his hands. He looked at Silas with an expression so raw and so devastated that it was almost unbearable to be in the room with the face of a man looking at the person who had fathered his son in his house under his name for 3 years. Say it then, Thomas said. His voice was barely above a whisper, shaking at every edge. Silas held his gaze and didn't flinch. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything. I know there's nothing I can say that changes what I did to you or to your father or to... His voice cracked briefly. He pushed through it. Leo doesn't know any of this. He knows you as his dad. That's real. Whatever I did, that part is real, and I'm not going to let what I did take that from him. Thomas's jaw worked. His eyes were bright and wet and furious, and something else underneath all of that. Something that looked impossibly like a man trying to figure out how to hold 2 completely contradictory things at the same time. Get out of my sight, Thomas said, his voice cracking on the last word. Just not yet. Stay there, but don't talk to me again tonight. Okay, Silas said quietly. Isabella had regained enough composure to attempt control of the room. She straightened up, squared her shoulders, and turned to me with the expression I had seen her use in courtrooms, measured, reasonable, the voice of a woman who believes she can still manage the narrative. Arthur, she said, and her voice was almost steady. Whatever you think this evidence shows, there are explanations for every piece of it. The LLC was a structuring decision tax strategy, nothing more. The emails with Marcus were exploratory correspondence. The evaluation was submitted to my attorney's office as supporting documentation for an Article 81 petition, James said flatly. Filed 3 days ago under your name. The word filed hit the room like a stone through glass. Isabella's composure fractured, not completely, not all at once, but visibly, the way expensive things break, with a kind of terrible slow-motion precision. Her chin lifted. Her nostrils flared. Her eyes went very bright and very hard. You cannot prove intent, she said. We have your emails, I said. We have 14 months of toxicology reports documenting arsenic in my bloodstream, with a compound signature traceable to Marcus Hale's pharmaceutical facility. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. We have a federal proffer statement from Curtis Grant, describing in detail every conversation you had with him about the dosing schedule, the Section 81 timeline, and the $800,000 you promised him. Marcus Hale stood up so fast his chair fell backwards. I have nothing to do with... Sit down, Marcus. Ray's voice came from the dining room entrance. He had come in from the side hallway exactly as we'd planned, and behind him were 2 agents in plain clothes, not uniformed, not dramatic, just present and immovable in the way that federal authority tends to be. Ray crossed the room at an unhurried pace and placed a document on the table in front of Marcus Hale. That's a federal preservation order, Ray said. It covers all communications records and physical assets connected to Hale Pharmaceuticals' DP7 program. If you attempt to destroy, alter, or transfer anything covered by that order, the obstruction charge alone carries 5 years. He paused. I'd sit down. Marcus Hale sat down. Ray turned to Isabella. Isabella Miller. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities, fraud, unlawful administration of a controlled substance, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sound Isabella made was not a scream and not a sob. It was something between the two, sharp and involuntary, the sound of a person whose entire architecture of control collapses in a single moment. Her hands flew to the table to keep herself upright, her whole body shaking now, and she looked at me across that table with eyes that were furious and desperate and frightened all at once. You planned all of this, she said, her voice raw and cracking. From the beginning. All of it. Not from the beginning, I said quietly. You gave me no choice. One of Ray's agents moved forward to take her arm gently. Isabella pulled away instinctively, then stopped the fight going out of her in one long, visible exhale like a fire running out of oxygen. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled and she blinked hard, furiously, refusing to let the tears fall in front of all of us. And in that moment, that single, unguarded moment before the agent guided her toward the door, I felt no triumph. I felt nothing as clean as victory. What I felt was a grief that had no specific address. For Thomas, who was sitting with his face in his hands and his whole body shaking. For Leo, asleep upstairs, innocent of everything. For the version of this family that might have existed if different choices had been made by different people at different crossroads over the last 14 months. For Eleanor, who had seen it coming and loved us all anyway. James, I said, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. James was already on his feet. I'll handle the documentation from here. Thomas lifted his head from his hands and looked at me. His face wet, his eyes hollowed out the expression of a man standing in the wreckage of something, and not yet sure what to do with his hands. Dad, he said hoarsely, what happens now? I crossed to him and put my hand on his shoulder. Now, I said, we figure out who we are on the other side of this. By 10 o'clock that night, the house had emptied of everyone except Thomas and me. Ray had left with his agents and with Isabella. Marcus Hale had been escorted to a separate vehicle for questioning at the federal field office in Manhattan. Not arrested, not yet, but the preservation order made clear that his options were narrowing by the hour. James had packed his documents with characteristic efficiency and pressed my hand at the door with both of his, the way he had at Eleanor's funeral, saying more with that gesture than most men could manage in a paragraph. Claire had gone upstairs without a word to anyone, and I had heard her door close then, 20 minutes later, the sound of her crying through the ceiling. Not the quiet, steady tears from the dining room, but the harder, uglier kind, the kind that comes when a person finally stops managing their own grief and lets it have them. I found Thomas in the kitchen. He was sitting at the island, with both hands wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't drunk, staring at the surface of it, like he was looking for something in the reflection. He had taken off his jacket, and his tie was loosened, and he looked utterly, completely undone, the way a man looks when the version of his life he has been maintaining collapses all at once, and he finds himself sitting in the rubble with no idea what to build next. He looked up when I came in. His eyes were red-rimmed raw, the lids swollen from what I suspected had been a private few minutes, somewhere between the dining room and here. I keep thinking about Leo, he said before I could speak. His voice was hoarse and unsteady. He's upstairs right now. He doesn't know any of this. He's just asleep, and tomorrow morning he's going to come downstairs and ask me for pancakes, and I'm going to have to—" He stopped. His throat worked hard. "How do I look at him, Dad? How do I look at him and not—" "You look at him," I said, sitting down across from him, "the way you always have. Because that little boy loves you. That doesn't change because of a DNA test." Thomas pressed the heel of his hand against his eye, hard, blinking fast. "She used him," he said, his voice cracking open on the words. "She put him in this house knowing what Silas was knowing what they were doing to you, and she used Leo as a prop in her own plan. And I just—" He set the glass down with a sharp sound and pressed both hands flat on the counter, and his shoulders heaved once, twice. And then he was crying fully, not trying to stop it. His whole body shaking with it, the kind of grief that comes from the bottom of a man who has been holding everything together with his bare hands for too long. I let him. I didn't reach for him immediately. I let him have the full weight of it, because some grief needs to be felt completely before you can move through it. When the shaking eased, I said quietly, "Thomas, I need to talk to you about what comes next." He wiped his face with the back of his hand and straightened up, pulling himself together with the visible, effortful determination of a man who has decided he is done falling apart for tonight. "Tell me," he said. "Ray needs your full cooperation. Testimony, documentation, everything you know about the Hale deal and the debt Isabella used to control you. In exchange, the prosecutor's office will take your cooperation into account. You won't face charges." I paused. "James has structured the contingent bequest. 400,000 enough to clear your debt and start clean. But it's conditional on your cooperation being complete and documented." Thomas nodded slowly. "And Leo." This was the part I had prepared for most carefully. "I've spoken with James and a family court attorney. Given Claire's knowledge of the poisoning and her failure to report it, there is a viable theory of child endangerment that the court can act on. If Claire consents to a temporary transfer of custodial rights, and given her position, she has very strong incentive to cooperate, and you agree to a temporary guardianship arrangement, I can apply for temporary guardianship of Leo through family court, while both you and Claire address your legal situations." Thomas stared at me. Something moved through his face, complicated, raw, 100 things at once. "Would you want to take care of him?" he said softly. I want to make sure he is safe," I said. "While you rebuild. It's not permanent, it's a bridge. You can rebuild your relationship with Leo on the other side of this. But right now he needs stability, and I need to know he's protected." Thomas looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were bright and wet again, and he pressed his lips together hard against whatever was trying to come out. "Dad," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I know I don't deserve to ask this. I know I spent 14 months being exactly the wrong kind of son. But—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "Are you going to be okay?" Actually okay. The question hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. I felt my own eyes sting just briefly, just enough, and I blinked it away. "Yes," I said. "I'm going to be better than okay." Thomas reached across the island and put his hand over mine. His grip was tight and unsteady, the grip of a man holding on because holding on is the only thing left to do. "I'll cooperate," he said. "Every single thing. I'll give them everything." "I know you will," I said. And for the first time in a very long time, sitting in that kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, with my son's hand over mine, and the weight of 14 months beginning slowly, painfully, necessarily, to lift, I believed that the worst of it was finally behind us. 3 months is a long time when you are learning how to breathe again. Helen called on the first Tuesday of December, and I knew from the warmth in her voice before she said a single word that the news was good. Full arsenic clearance. she said. This month's hair samples are clean. Arthur, you are going to be completely fine. I was sitting on the porch steps of the Vermont cabin when she called. I pressed the phone against my chest after she hung up and looked out at the pale December sky and the bare trees and the first thin dusting of snow on the ground, and I felt it move through me like something unlocking relief so complete and so physical that my eyes stung with it. Grandpa. Leo appeared in the doorway behind me, still in his pajamas, dark hair sticking up on one side, clutching the one-eyed stuffed elephant he carried everywhere. Your face is doing a funny thing. I laughed, a real one, the kind that catches you off guard. It's doing a very good thing, I said. Come here. He came without a second's hesitation, climbed straight into my lap with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once doubted his welcome, and immediately began telling me about a dream involving dinosaurs and an inexplicably large sandwich. I held him against my chest and listened to every word and thought, this is what all of it was for. The legal proceedings had moved with the grinding weight of federal machinery. Isabella had been formally charged in October wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy, unlawful administration of a controlled substance. Marcus Hale was cooperating with prosecutors in New Jersey, trading information for leniency. Silas Curtis Grant had entered his cooperation agreement. His sentencing was pending. Claire had consented to the temporary guardianship transfer and was living with family in Connecticut. She had not contacted Leo. Thomas was in Boston. He called every Sunday, without exception. 2 weeks ago, his voice had been rough and halting when he asked, "Does he ask about me?" "Every single day," I said. "He wants to know when you're coming to see the cabin." Thomas went quiet on his end, not empty but full, the pressurized quiet of a man holding himself together by the thinnest thread. "Then soon, Dad. I promise. Soon. We'll be here," I said. "Take your time and do it right." That Sunday call was the one that told me Thomas was going to be okay. Not whole yet, not close to whole, but moving in the right direction, which is the only direction that matters. That same evening, after Leo had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and opened Eleanor's letter one final time. The folds were soft now from handling her handwriting exactly as it had always been, warm and direct, and slightly uneven in the places where her hands had given her trouble. I read the part about the dandelions. A weed is just a flower that nobody important decided to value. I'm teaching him that, I said quietly to the empty kitchen. He already knows it better than most adults. The Eleanor Miller Children's Heart Foundation had processed its first grant cycle in November. 17 pediatric cardiac programs across 6 states. James had sent a one-line note with the report. She would have been proud. I had read that line 4 times. Leo reappeared in the doorway with his elephant, escaped from bed with the determination only a 3-year-old can sustain past 9 o'clock at night. "Grandpa," he announced very seriously, "the elephant can't sleep." I folded Eleanor's letter, tucked it into my pocket, and opened my arms. "Then both of you come here," I said. "Tell me what's wrong." He climbed up without ceremony, settled against my chest, and began explaining the elephant's very complicated feelings about December. I listened to every word. Outside the kitchen window, snow was falling on Vermont, soft and unhurried, covering everything evenly, the way grace does when you finally stop fighting it and let it land. 68 years old. Clean blood. 1 grandson who talked to stuffed animals. 1 son finding his way back. 1 foundation carrying Eleanor's name into the world. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If there is one thing this grandpa stories taught me, it is that love without boundaries is not love. It is an open door for people who have already decided to walk through it and take everything you own. I trusted too easily. I looked away too often. I told myself that peace in the family was worth more than the truth, And I was wrong because the peace I was protecting was never real. It was a performance that cost me 14 months of my health, my dignity, and nearly my life. Don't be like me. Don't wait for the evidence to find you. If something in your gut tells you that the people around you are not who they say they are, listen. Listen early while you still have time to act instead of react. I believe God gave me those 14 months not to punish me, but to show me what mattered. He gave me Leo's dandelions. He gave me Eleanor's letter. He gave me just enough time to build a wall before the flood arrived. This is the heart of every real family story, not the betrayal, but what you choose to do with it. You can collapse or you can build something better from the wreckage. I chose to build. My personal belief is simple. The people who try hardest to control what you own are usually the ones most afraid of who you are. Every Grandpa Stories channel, every family story told here exists for one reason, so that someone somewhere recognizes the warning signs before I did.